we go. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Shvis, Pedig Gimel, Halacha, Pedig Beis, Halacha Gimel. We're learning today Daf Yud. We left off on Daf Tes Amud Beis, the last line, beginning with the new Mishnah with Halacha Gimel. The Mishnah, as we mentioned when we learned Halacha Beis and Halacha Gimel, they go together. The Mishnah will continue to list various agricultural labors that are permitted in advance of Shvi'is, but all the way until Rosh Hashanah. Before we go on, I would like to read the Rambam, even though we are repeating something that we said before Halacha Beis, but we have to keep that in mind the whole time, that the Mishnah, speaking about something that's permitted prior to Rosh Hashanah, is speaking about during the times of the Beis HaMikdash. I think that's the best way to word it. As we're going forward, we're getting better ways of framing things. So when the Gabbai asked, L'may nafkamina, because the third Beis HaMikdash is going to be built. In other words, the abolishment of the Isur Shnei Perakim was based on the fact that there's no Beis HaMikdash, or Tosefes Shvius is only to begin with Midrabanan. I want to read this in the Rambam, get the Rambam's words. I'm going in the Rambam, Hilcha Shmita B'Yovel, the third chapter, Pedig Shlishi. We're going to learn Halacha Aleph, and then we're going to learn a little shtickle of Halacha Tes. But let's go with Halacha Aleph. He writes like this: Avodas ha'aretz b'shana shishis, working on the land at the end of the 6th year. When at the end? Shloishim yoim somech l'shvis, 30 days prior. Asura halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Why? Mipnei shehu misakna l'shvis. Because whatever you do then is already going to be benefiting. It's going to be preparing the land for the 7th year. Weiter, the Dover Zeh says that Rambam is only bisman shebeis hamikdash kayim. I'm not going past. I'm going past in future. Shenesan mipi hashmua. That's clearly from the Eibishter. Now, based on this Isur Doiraisa Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, Gozru Chachamim, the Chachamim added to it. And they said, Shelo yiu charshim sdei ilan erev shvius bisman hamikdash, only until Atzeres. That no one should be plowing stay loven ad haPesach. And then the Rambam concludes, this is the first halacha. Ubisman she'ein mikdash, when there is no temple standing, then you can work avodas ha'aretz until Rosh Hashanah kedin Torah. Period. So that's a very important premise. In other words, whatever we're learning now in the Mishnah Chiddush, that certain agricultural works could be done until the end of the 6th year, that's bisman hamikdash. That's Bisman HaMikdash. And I'm going on in the Rambam before we continue with our introduction. Same Pedig, Hilcha Shmita V'Yovel Pedig Gimel, Halacha Tes. Says the Rambam, V'chol hadvarim ha'elu, everything that Rambam mentioned may not be done at the end of the 6th year, is again only Bisman HaMikdash, K'may Shomarnu. Aval Bisman Hazeh. Bisman Hazeh means prior to the building of the 3rd temple. Mutarim Aveidas Ha'aretz Ad Rosh Hashanah. This is Gavaldik. And then the Rambam brings our Mishnah. Then he says that even during the times of the Beis HaMikdash, when we had Tosefes Shvius, 30 days, and on that the Chachamim added the plowing, even then, mutar l'sakal asadis, you can remove the stones, you can be mezabel, you can fertilize, la'adr, you can hoe. What can you hoe? Hamid choice for hamid lois, or the way we learned clearly yesterday, and you can do all agricultural works, even plowing, by a Beis HaShalchin. In the Girsa that I have from Rabbi Steinsaltz's Evan Yisrael's Rambam, he always wrote Beis HaShalohin with a hay. So as we mentioned, that if it's a field that is irrigated with water, then you can do not only mikchois and mitlois, you can do everything. Not only if it's existing, even if it's not planted yet. Ad Rosh Hashanah. Umeyablin, umefarkin, umeapkin, umeashnin, and the Rambam begins to quote over here dinim that we're learning in our Mishnah. So at least we put this in context. That what we are learning right now, behemshich to what we learned yesterday, is Bisman HaMikdash. That's why you need to have that it can be done in the 6th year. When there's no Beis HaMikdash, you can do everything until the 7th year. And again, L'may nafkamina, we're not just talking about the past, because that means that when the 3rd temple is going to be built, only these exceptions will be allowed to the exclusion, let's say, of plowing. That will go back to the way it is. That plowing, stay ha'ila, the shvua, stay love and Pesach. Okay. Now, what we're going to have new in today's Mishnah is that, in Hilchas Shabbos, just as an example, by Isurei Shabbos, any of the malachas that you do with a shinui, you take a notch down. That's the big rule. So if something is asin midoiraisa, you do it with the shinoi. Generally, it becomes only asin midrabanan. If something is only asin midrabanan, like muksa, you do it with the shinoi. Generally, it's mutter. Mutter. We're going to learn the concept of a shinoi vis-a-vis the laws of shvi'is. And we will see everything in the Mishnah and the Gemara, Tanoim, Amiroim, how doing something with the shinoi might be helpful, might actually make something that's asin midrabanan mutter to be done. There'll be a lot of attention today on a very interesting agricultural practice when it comes to a fig tree. Figs could remain unripe on the tree without help. The help that they did to the figs is that they would take little wooden splinters of wood, and they would put oil on the tip, and they would perforate the fig, so they would get the oil inside the fig. Okay, the Mishnah will use the words oiling it and piercing it. This is more or less what it means. Either they put oil on the outside, or they also pierced it so the oil should go on the inside. The Mishnah is going to be speaking about figs that are on the tree on the 6th. Question is, can you oil it and pierce it? Because it will only become ripe on the 7th. So there's a question of whether you can do it on the 6th year. There's a question whether you can do it on the 7th year. The argument would be that these are figs of the 6th. Similarly, if the figs grew on the tree on the 6th, on the 7th, it's not ripe. Could you pierce it and oil it on the 8th? Why not? Because you can argue it's produce of the 7th. That will be a big, that's going to take up a lot of space in today's daf. A lot that we will learn will be based on something that we introduced yesterday, and using the words in the Bavli that we don't find over here, is the difference between oikume ilana versus avruye ilana. That any activity that you are doing to be making the tree, just to maintain it, to prevent it from deteriorating, from preventing it from getting ruined, is going to be a lot more permissible versus any activity that will also promote its growth. We'll see that today. Many times you do something, you're doing it to maintain it, but you know that this not only will maintain it, it's actually going to better it. That will be a lot more problematic. And we'll have some discussion specifically about watering trees prior to Shvi'is. Again, where the produce on the trees will become ready on Shvi'is. And the question is, are you allowed to water it? Even though you're only doing it on the 6th. But again, during that time that we had this Tosefah Shvi'is, we're going to have a whole different way of how you could water. Do you have to make a shinoi? Do you not need to make a shinoi? That is going to be the halacha gimel, because God willing, we're going to go all the way until the next Mishnah, which begins on Daf Yud Aleph. So let's go, Chavra. The last line. First of all, this is fascinating because we're learning a lot about agriculture. So says the Mishnah that another work that is permitted until Rosh Hashanah. Mizahamin es hanetiyos. We're speaking here about saplings, that they need to have some sort of foul-smelling, unpleasant substance smeared on the tree, and that is either to repel rodents, worms, bugs, or sometimes a piece of the bark of the tree would become detached. It becomes detached. They mamish call it a disease. There are doctors over here. And the way they would heal the tree is by putting dung. It's like a fertilizer, which smells bad. They would put it on the wound, on where the bark is detached. They would wrap it to keep it in place. And they would bandage it. And the Mishnah is saying that's something that you are allowed to do on the 6th tree. And as we'll see, both of them are being done for the tree not to get ruined. Okay. And you're doing this on the 6th year. The next thing is the karchanoisim. You can wrap them. Now, this wrapping, according to the ones who explain, mizahamin means putting dung and wrapping it with a bandage. So the karchen is not that the tree got sick, but sometimes the weather, either the sun is too strong or the cold is too bad for trees. And when you wrap it with a material, you simply protect it from the elements. Again, this is an activity that you are allowed to do until Rosh Hashanah, which would all imply that on the 7th year, you may not do it. Right? Daf Yud on the top. Next activity is koitmin oisam. Now, koitmin, the Rash in Mishnayos says it means snipping off the tips of the branches. Okay? And it's something similar to pruning. It's not to promote better vines. Pruning is you cut off for it to grow better. Here you're snipping off the tip of the branches to make sure that the sap that's already in the tree moves around better. Why do you want the sap to move around better? You want more of the sap to go into the fruit. Next activity, making bottom. Making bottom, mamish, means making shelters. Making shelters mean that just like we spoke about the wrapping is to protect it from the elements. Sometimes the tree needs shade from extreme weather. Let's speak about heat, because in Eretz Yisrael, right, it's summer. So you would build like these little tents. So the Mishnah says you are allowed to do it. The chiddush of what we're learning isn't only what you could do, is that you can only do it until Rosh Hashanah, which means, according to the Tanakama, none of these activities can be done on the 7th year. So we're speaking even about making a button. And finally, this is going to be the big one. Umashkin oisan, you can water them. So you can water them ad Rosh Hashanah. Chavra, take a look inside the Rashi Ilio. This is important. On the right column, 10, 11 times from the top. In the beginning of the line, Divrei HaMaskal Umashkin oisan. You can water the trees. We're speaking about trees until Rosh Hashanah. In other words, holds the Tanakama, implying avoloi b'shviz. You cannot water trees on shviz. Why? The Tolda the Noiteya Hava. Guys, the Torah writes explicitly on Bahar 4 malachas you cannot do. One of them is to sow. And we already learned in the previous chapter that planting a tree and sowing is the same thing. Now, watering is not planting. What is Asr Doiraisa? Putting a seed of vegetables, putting a natia, putting a little tree in the ground is called sowing. That's Asr Doiraisa. What's a tulda of planting? Watering. Interesting. And remember, Chavra, by Shabbos, a tulda is Asr Midoiraisa. Why do we have others? Why do we have tuldas? To group them together. If you did them both behelamachas, you only chayv one chatas. If you did the aven, it's tulda. Here by Shvius, a tulda is Asr Midrabanan. So watering is Asr Midrabanan. But why? It's a tulda de noiteya. Furthermore, we have to read the words in the Rashi Ilio. Umashkin oisan, when the Mishnah writes, the Tanakama holds that you could water it until Rosh Hashanah, he doesn't mean you have to make a shinoi, which is something we'll get to in a moment. What could you do? Normal. Bein alo ikar, where you can water it directly on the roots, which is the normal way. Ki orchaya b'kol lishani, the way you water it every year. And v'kolchrein, and certainly the Tanakama holds that you can water it erev Shvi is on the 6th year, all the way until the end, al hanoif, on the branches. Watering a tree on the branches is a shinoi, is an unusual way of watering. The yored al iker, have a shinoi. That's very important. Now,
Rabbi, sorry, question. Could you sell the trees for the 7th year and have someone else water them, and the produce gets saved, everything
we're going to
gets
get
saved?
to later, just whether he's asking whether you can do a mechira, the concept of mechira. I'm telling you, the fact is that right now, many people do that. There's a whole question whether Shemitah today is Doiraisa or Derabanan, right? I know by Chametz, which is an Isur Doiraisa, we sell.
Exactly.
Sell. The concept of selling is used. Does every Fruma community rely on selling? No. Some communities are more machmer, but it's very easy for us to be machmer when our livelihood does not come from agriculture. But the concept of mechira theoretically will be something that is okay. The challenge with selling, the difference between selling chametz and selling anything in Israel, is because I'm allowed to sell my chametz to a goy, and we're not allowed to sell land to goyim in Eretz Yisrael. Adarabba, we have a mitzvah to buy land from the goyim.
Even temporarily.
Even temporarily. And if I'm not mistaken, right, all of the Isur de Rabbanim, when it comes to a sale, because of the mitzvah of buying land in Israel, I can buy land on Shabbos. Because the Isur of buying land, if you remember, buying and selling is also midrabanan. Why? You might make a contract. The mitzvah,
but that also goes to Hakira? That also goes to Hakira? When you rent out the land for a few years?
No, it doesn't go to renting. It goes to selling. Big difference. But renting won't resolve Kevan's concept of Shemitah. In other words, goyim are not commanded in the mitzvahs. But let's leave that. I'm sure we're going to learn about this. Okay.
No, but Hakira is with the Aris, where he gets the percentage of the
Even
land.
that, it doesn't own the land. That's the beauty. He doesn't own the land. It's Jewish land. He's getting paid by getting a percent of the produce. Doesn't own that. That's another. It's a form of rent. Rent is not a problem. If you own an apartment, you can Airbnb it out, and you have no problem. And if you sell it, you got to. I'm saying with the okay. Now let's leave it at that. Let's leave it at that. So at least we introduced that Rasha is already introducing us that the Tanakama doesn't need for you to make a shinoi on the 6th year, and on the 7th year, even with the shinoi, it won't work. Now, back in the Mishnah, Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok Omer, hold on a second. I'm more lenient. Af mashkohu es anoif b'shvis. Even on the 7th, you have a tree. The tree needs to have water. And guys, we know that if you don't water the tree when it needs the water, the tree will die. And what was the rule that we began yesterday? We'll continue. That ivruye ilana is asr. Doing something that promotes growth based on the isur of noiteya. I got it. Watering is a tulda, the rabbanan of planting. Fine. But if I'm not watering to make it grow, I'm watering it to make sure it doesn't die. That's something that you can do. So he says, elamad, make a shinoi. How do you make a shinoi in watering? How do you make a change? By only water the branches. Not on the base. Not on the base. Here again, in other words, Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok also agrees with the Tanakama Chevra that on the 6th year you don't have to make any change. But the Tanakama holds that on the 7th year it's asan midrabanan and a shinoi won't help. Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok says no, you can make a shinoi. Weiter. Now, the next topic. Sochin ala pagin. A pag is an unripe fig. Interesting expression, right? Pegara. I don't know if it's connected to this. Or pegatoy, if there's such a thing. So you have
also a baby that is born before time in Hebrew called pag.
I love it. Now we know why. Because it's a borrowed term from an unripe fig. Now, figs, first of all, we learned so many things about figs. First, we had in the last chapter about how we use a fig tree as the ground zero to make that measurement. Remember the 3 trees in the base. 20 mana per fig. Here we're using the fig as a whole topic. So we also learned that figs are not harvested at the same time, if you remember. Whenever we speak about the space that you need around the tree, kimaloi oire v'saloi. Oire is the lashon that's used exclusively for harvesting figs. So here we have an unripe fig. And one of the steps that we need to do to help them become ripened is to smear them with oil, and even better, to pierce them, to come up with something very thin, with a toothpick. And on the toothpick, you put a little bit of oil, so the oil goes inside the fig, and that allows the fig to properly, look at Kevin finding a picture. I don't know if he found a picture on Google or if he made this is great, or if this is intelligent. What's it called?
This is AI.
AI. Can you put a yarmulke on the picker? It should be a yid with tzitzis and on a beard, not the little beard.
Rabbi, when the sun is beating down on the farm workers, they're wearing those kind of hats.
I want a shtreimel, a Jew, a
Just
Jewish
takes more
farmer.
time. Yes.
Okay, so Sochin es apagin. So he says again, we're speaking about now. There's many steps here, guys. There's the 6th year, the 7th year, and the 8th year, and there's going to be details in that. So you could smear the pagin, and not only smear them, but also umenakban, you can pierce them until Rosh Hashanah. Okay, now what's unclear in the Mishnah, we'll have a machlokes amoraim to understand the Tanakama. Are we speaking about smearing and piercing them on the 6th year for them to become ripe on the 6th year? Or are we speaking yachidish, that even with the smearing and the piercing, even if it's only going to become ripe on the 7th year, now, of course, no one can properly harvest kedarkoi on the 7th year, but you can pick it. You can harvest for you to eat. So even if you know it's going to only become ripened on the 7th year, since what you are doing is on the 6th, you are allowed to do it. Okay? And again, the chiddush would be is because it's going to be consumed on the 7th, so you might have thought you can't. And the Tanakama is saying that you could. Okay, but if they are unripe, now, is this a new case? Is this the same case? If pagei erev shvius nichnas l'shvius, let's go pshat right now. Again, we're going to see in the Gemara two pshatim. So the first case, let's go, would be that when could you smear and pierce them? If they are unripe on the 6th year, but your smearing and piercing will make them ripe on the 6th year. So that's no problem. What's the chiddush? Because if you wouldn't have smeared it and pierced it, it only would have become ripe on the 7th year. So the Mishnah says, so what? If you'll do something and it will become ripe on the 6th year, then you can do it. But if it's on the 6th year, and you want to know whether you can smear it and pierce it, but it will only become ripe on the 7th, that's pagei erev shvius shenichnasu l'shvius. Or if something grew on the 7th year, you're not going to pick it on the 7th year. You're not going to pick it on the 7th year. They will only be picked on the 8th year. So now the question is, can you pierce them on the 8th year? On the 8th year. And why not? Because it's a product of the 7th year. The shal shvius sheyotzel might say shvius. Says the Tanakama, he's that loy sachin v'loy menak v'noisim. You may not do it. In other words, in both sides, and the latter one, since it grew on the 7th, it has kedusha of the 7th. And he holds, the Tanakama holds, that anything that may not be done on the Shemitah year, 2 peiros of the Shemitah year, cannot be done even on the 8th year. In the first case, the Tanakama will hold that even though it's produce of the 6th year, because it grew on the 6th year, it's just not ripe, and you're doing the avoid on the 6th year, since midrabanan it will only be consumed on the 7th year, you also cannot do anything, even not on the 6th year. However, Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient. Now, Rabbi Yehuda, clear, we'll see from the Gemara, is only speaking about the case of the 6th that will ripen on the 7th. That's the case that he's talking about. And there he's lenient. Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, it depends on the minig. Depends on the minig. If everyone is doing it, everyone views this as an avoida, you can't do it. We'll see more the logic in the Gemara. But in a place where people regularly do not do it, Rabbi Yehuda is going to hold, then you are allowed to do it. You are allowed to do what? You are allowed to smear and pierce on the 6th, even when you do it, it's only going to be ready on the 7th, but you can do it. A lot more of this in the Gemara. I'm saying this will take up a big place of the Gemara. Now, Rab Shimon is very lenient, Bechal. Rab Shimon mater be'ilan. Rab Shimon holds that any type of work that you want to do after the 8th year, right? We said that Tanakama holds, and that Rabbi Yehuda did not disagree. Let me just say these words again, that any product that grew on the 7th year, even though you did not harvest it on the 7th year, is called, number one, something that's imbued with Kedusha Shvius, and therefore, any type of malacha that's usher to do on the 7th year is also usher to do on the 8th year on Peiros Shvius. Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda.
You can't do that work, but is Rabbi Yehuda opining on what you can actually do with that produce? Like,
no, Rabbi Yehuda.
There's a fig from the 7th year.
No, the produce, Danny, that's a different topic. Anything that's called Peiros Shvius, we didn't even learn yet, will be imbued with Kedusha Shvius. You cannot harvest it kedarkoi. You can harvest it for you to eat, and it's going to have the restriction of you can't do business with it, and it's going to have the restriction of biur Shvius. And you can't take it out of Israel. There'll be many restrictions we'll learn about later. We didn't get there yet. Here we're speaking about, can you do something to it while it's on the tree? The Tanakam and Rabbi Yehuda holds that something that grew on the tree on the 7th year, even though it's not ripe, it's called Peiros Shvius, and anything that may not be done to it on the tree on the 7th cannot be done on the 8th. Says Rab Shimon, no, that when we're speaking about the 8th, Rab Shimon matir be'ilan. Why? Because mepnei shehu reshoy ba'avoda su'ilan. Rab Shimon holds that any melacha could be done on the 8th year to the tree itself. We have to only rest on the 7th. You don't have to make any type of restriction to the tree itself on the 8th. So therefore, fruit on the tree on the 8th, even though it grew on the 7th, whatever you can do to the tree now, you can do to the peiros right now.
Follow the concept of hefset meruba, maybe?
We're not using hefset meruba, even though we're going to get there in a moment. Okay, Vlad is saying, does Hefsid Meruba have to do with any of it? I can tell you it could be. Right? This is new to me, all of this. What I did read in the Noise Kalim in the beginning is that generally everything that we learned, now we finished both Mishnayos and we learned a total of 17 malachas. The reason why you could do it is either because it's even on Shemitah, it's only Yasum Midrabanan. And second of all, because what you're doing is preventing ruin. Now, preventing ruin is never on the produce. So far. Up until now, we were speaking about, we don't want the tree to get ruined. We don't want the land to get ruined. You're already mentioning you're going to lose the fruit. Could be.
They're talking about piercing the fruit.
Correct. Which will make it ripe or not ripe. Correct. Could be. Could be. Could be. Okay.
Just to be clear, according to Reb Shimon, is he saying that once we enter the 8th year, the produce that's on the tree, that's still on the tree,
that's exactly what he's saying. There's
it
no
now becomes 8th year produce. And
that's
you can
what he's
harvest
saying.
And do whatever you want with
that's
it.
what he's saying.
Whereas the other opinion, it's like if it
Both
grew
hold.
during the 7th,
Exactly.
then it's considered attached to the 7th.
Add this one liner. Anything that grew on the 7th, whatever the restrictions are on the 7th, whatever cannot be done on the 7th, cannot be done on the 8th, because it's Peiros of Shemitah. Guys, we have to get going. It's mamish late. So first of all, the Mishnah opened up with a few activities that could be done out of Shvi'is, Mizahamin Asanatiyos. And again, like we mentioned, the Chiddush is not that you could put this bandage on. The Chiddush is that you can only do it until Rosh Hashanah, which implies that on Rosh Hashanah, right, let's say you have a wound on a tree and you want to put the dung and to bandage it, you can't do that. So says the Gemara, whoa, not everyone agrees with that. That's a big chumrah. That our Mishnah only follows Rabbi. B'ram kirabanan. Kirabanan. We have befedish in a braysa that it could be done even on Shemitah. The braysa says, mizahamin, you can apply this foul-smelling to get rid of the bugs, to prevent the bugs, to heal the tree. Mizahamin, misalin is another detail that we never learned about in the Mishnah. Excuse me. And that is to deworm, to get rid of the worm. That you are allowed to do it even on the Shemitah year. Because if you won't do it, it's going to get ruined. And the contrast that the Braisa is making is between Shemitah and Chol HaMoed. How fascinating. Now, we generally follow the rule that Chol HaMoed, the premise of Chol HaMoed is there are days in which there is an Isur Melacha Midoiraisa. We're going to go with that Shita. Eloma, there are 5 heterim. Many hold, if something would be Yasser Midoiraisa, there would never be a heter. We're not going with that. The Torah says it's a Moed. The Torah implies it's not as asud as the first and the last. By the first and the last, the Torah writes Leisasa by Malacha. So the Torah already tells us that you can't do work, but some work you could do. And who is Megala, what Hashem means, the Chachamim. Avaloi b'moyed. You know, there's an Isur of Malacha. Deworming a tree is an Isur Malacha. Putting dung in a bandage, which is healing, is an Isur Malacha. It's a separate thing. Shvi it's about, like we mentioned, you're not allowed to be avruye ilana. Oikume ilana is mutter, you can do it. However, kan v'kan, says the Braisa, ein migazmin. Migazmin is some sort of cutting the branches, connected to stimulating growth, whether this is pruning, whether it's something similar to pruning. Anything that promotes the growth cannot be done, even on Shemitah. Aval, yes, when it comes to deworming, on the other hand, that if a worm is visible to the eye and you're removing that worm, it's not even called the malacha. Right? If we're going to speak about the malacha of separating, I know this is a whole topic, when you separate the psoilus min ha'oichel without getting, that is not called the malacha on Chol HaMoed. Okay, Bekitzer, what do we see over here? That our Mishnah that says that Mizaham in a Sanatiyas only until Rosh Hashanah is only Rabbi. The Chachamim argue. So now, the Gemara is going to want to know, why don't the Chachamim add other leniencies? For example, that Rabbi Yosi Amar, Rabavuna boy, he quoted the question that Rabavuna asked. Ma ben hamizayim loisal abayis. In other words, our Mishnah said, now we know that it's Rebbe, that can you build a house, a little tent, a little shelter, a little hut to protect the trees from the elements? Our Mishnah says only until the Rosh Hashanah. Now, l'chu'ura, the Chachamim who allowed the mizahamin, why would they also not allow making a bias? But they never said, nowhere did we find that they allow. That means that they agree that building a home, building a shelter, is something that's asur on Shemitah. Why? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. That hamizahem, when it comes to applying this foul-smelling dung on the tree, einoi ela kamoishiv shomer, it does not promote growth at all. All it is, he gives a great example. If you are afraid that a ganef is going to come into the field and steal, I'm allowed to put a shomer on Shemitah. I'm not working the land. I'm not bettering. I'm just preventing someone from taking what should not be taken. Putting this bandage on the tree, putting the dung on the tree does not promote growth. It just prevents the illness to take over the tree. However, when you build a shelter, bias, oisolot sale, it makes shade. And what happens when there's shade? Even if your intention is primarily to prevent it from getting ruined, but shade will also stimulate growth. The foul-smelling bandage does not promote growth at all. Amazing. Bias, oisolot sale, and when the tree has sale, it's going to also grow. So that's why even the Chachamim are moide that's not something that you are allowed to do. This is a gewaldige piece of Gemara. Turning Chedra to Daf Yudam base. I'm happy because it's getting late. There's so much information packed in over here. Now, says the Gemara that in the next in 2 chapters, in Perek Daled, in Halachah Daled, in our pagination and Daf Chav Tesamid Beis, says the Gemara, we learn in the Mishnah soon, Taninon Tamon Taninon, that what? That Hamevakeya Bizayis, if a person takes wood off an olive tree during Shemitah, why did they take wood off? They need wood. What happens when you take wood off a tree, and we're speaking about using an axe, any cut on the tree potentially will create a problem of dryness in that place. And the dryness can dry the tree out. So if someone cuts a piece of wood off an olive tree on the Shemitah year, so the Mishnah says that lo yechape ba'afer, you may not cover the cut with earth. But what could you do? Aval machasuhu, either with stones or with straw, you can cover. And the Gemara, what lamay nafkamina? That's the nafkamina. Both earth and the stones and straw, the primary reason why the person is putting it on that cut is it shouldn't dry out. But the question is, will it also promote growth? And the answer is, it depends. Earth will also promote growth. The avanim and kash will not promote growth. And that's a big thing. So it doesn't matter about what is my intent. It's about the mitzias. Anything that promotes growth will be awesome. Asr midrabanan, guys. Asr midra, promoting growth on a tree, we read, is a tulda of noiteya. Noiteya and ziriya is taka asr doiraisa. You got it? And here, promoting growth is a tulda, which is asr. But if you're doing it only to prevent it dying, then it's okay. And the Gemara asked Rabbi Yoina Oimed that Rabbi Avuna boy, ma ben kashu ma ben offer. Here's what we just said by heart. Oh, thank you very much for the tzitzis and for the tchelas gavaldik in the picture. Kashin einoi elo kamoishiv shoimer. In one of the Lubavitcher Sipuri of our people during the times of the Mittel Rebbe, so people used to have fields, and in there they would make a fabrengen in these fields, unlike Bo'emer. I don't know if you remember all of these stories, and the description was just like the picture. Just we didn't have tchelas then of the Hasidim out in the fields and how they would make a big fabrengen over there. That's what it would look like. Okay, the Mittel Rebbe wanted for people to become farmers. Many Lubavitcher families come from mishpachas that were farmers. That's all under the instruction of the Mittel Rebbe. He got land from the Tsar in the Kharson area, and thousands of Lubavitcher families settled there. Thousands. Kashin einoi elo kameshiv shoimer. If you're putting kashin, by the way, kashin also means the avanim. It doesn't promote growth at all. All it does is it prevents the tree from drying out. It's like putting a shoimer. You can do it on Shemitah, on Shvius. Afar, Even if I'm only putting it to prevent it from drying out, but also latina, the earth, if it rains, it somehow, or it takes from the moisture of the tree, it becomes muddy. The moment it becomes muddy, it promotes growth as well. Great. Okay, now let's go to watering. Watering is the same issue. So what did we learn in our Mishnah? We had that machlokes, right? Before Shvius, everyone holds that you don't have to make a shinoi. But on Shvius, the Tanakama hold you can't water even with the shinoi. And then, right, Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok, right, Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok says that he's more lenient. He says that even on Shvius, you can water with the shinoi. What was his shinoi? Throw the water on the branches. We're going to learn about other types of shinuyim. Says the Gemara Tani. First of all, let's begin to prior to Shemitah. In our Mishnah, you can do whatever you want. Says a Braisa that Rabbi Yossi ben Kupar says in the name, these are all Tanoim of Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, right? Rabbi Elazar ben Pados, that's the Amoira. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua is the Tana. That gives machlokes b'sham hayoimrim mashke al hanoif. Even before Shvius, look how stringent Beshama is. You can only water on the branches, and the water will be yoyred alo ikar. That's what Rabbi Elazar says in our Mishnah, right? On Shemitah. No. There's no restrictions on the 6th year. Mashke ben ananoif ben alo ikar. Basically, our Mishnah places no restriction on pre-Shvius. Clear. Our Mishnah obviously is following the sheet of Beis Hillel as it should be. Now let's move on to An Shemitah proper. So now the Rabbi Yanai, in the household of Rabbi Yanai, right? They allowed a shinoi. How did they do a shinoi? Mashke besola, no, sala. Sala is a basket. So a basket is a shinoi because instead of putting the water directly, they would put water in a basket. A basket is filled with holes, and then the water would run out of the basket. Omar Rabbi Yaakov bar Zavdei. That you should know that Rabbi Yitzchak bar Tavlai also mashke besalo. Omar Rabbi Chia bar Ba. You should know that Rabbi Yuden bar Giriya also mashke besalo. Guys, we're speaking about on the Shemitah year, but here comes the kicker. Not only did he allow water being thrown with a shinoi, because watering is only asan midrabanan. The problem is if you don't water the tree, it's going to get ruined. So you're doing something la'oikuma ilana. Do it with the shinoi, but here comes even va'adar. Wow. Va'adar means that he would hoe, but he would hoe it, guys, right after he watered. Because the purpose of hoeing was not to work the ground. The purpose of hoeing is to make sure the water goes. That's what the Manafulda says. Va'adar tachas ilan. Why? Sheyakonsumayim l'shrasha. Now, there's two ways of learning the next line. Either the next line is akasha, or the Pnei Moshe says it's an explanation. The first Manafulda. Frag the Gemara, how was he allowed to do the va'adar? Frag the Gemara, which says the Manafulda bit me up. Well, you can't hoe the ground. We said hoeing is not charisha mamish, but it's charisha. So the Gemara is asking, and according to the Manafulda, v'loy meshane klum. We don't have an answer. The Pnei Moshe learns it very different. Pnei Moshe is mamish min ol ra'amid. He would say, when he would hoe the tree, he would say, I am not doing this to work the land. He would make sure there shouldn't be a marasai. Now, normally making announcements don't work. He would say, you think I'm doing this to work? He would say it. No, I'm doing it because if the roots won't get water, the tree will get ruined. I'm not doing any work on the land. I'm preventing my tree from drying out. And because of that declaration, he was allowed not only to water with the shinoi, but he was adar. Now, my thing is if he's allowed to hoe, by the hoeing, he didn't make a shinoi. Why did he even have to make a shinoi with the watering? I don't know. Kash, let's go right. Now, another thing. Says during the days of the great Rabbi Chia bar Ba, right? Havoin mashkin deklaya, they would water palm trees on Shvi'is. But what would they do? They would make a shinoi. Again, what's the shinoi? They would use bikinishna chadata, a new broom, or a vechavrasa. Chavrasa, I looked in Google, guys. Maybe Kevin will find it. A palm leaf whisk. It's very thin branches that are bunched together. And these were ways where instead of you pouring the water directly, you would dip it into the water and you would put it on the tree. If you'll see a picture, you'll see it. All of this, guys, all of this is that all of these activities on the Shemitah year was not to promote growth. l'choira didn't even promote growth. Maybe it wasn't enough water to promote growth. It prevented the tree from drying out. Okay, right. Let's move on to the figs now. This is the big one. There are two ways we had in the Mishnah the Tanakama. We spoke about figs of the 6th going into the 7th. We spoke about figs of the 7th going into the 8th. Clearly, the 7th going into the 8th, the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda are on one side, and Rabbi Shimon is the lenient one. The Gemara is not even going to go there. What we will go to is to better understand the Machlokes Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. Now, like I mentioned, when we learned the Mishnah, that when you have figs of the 6th, there are two scenarios. One scenario would be that they are unripe on the 6th. You want to smear and pierce them on the 6th, and if you'll do that, they'll be ready on the 6th. That's one case. The other case is that what you're going to be doing on the 6th won't help you for the 6th. Even if you smear it and pierce it, it's only going to become ripe on the 7th. Now, what was the case of the Tanakama, and what is the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda is a subject to a machlokes amoraim. That's it. Let's read it inside. So the Gemara begins by saying that Anan Taninon, the way we learn the Mishnah, Shitas Tanakama, is Sochen as Hapagin, that you can smear the oil, right? And not only smear it, but pierce them. We're speaking about the Tanakama Shita until Rosh Hashanah. So that will be case number one. And according to this understanding that if the Tanakama, when we read the Mishnah, it sounded from the Mishnah that the Tanakama does not allow it, right? Rabbi Yehuda allowed it. So he says, hold on. The Tanakama does allow it if you're doing it before Rosh Hashanah. One way of understanding the Tanakama is you have to know how to read it. That you are allowed to smear and pierce the figs on the 6th year, even if it's going to be going into the 7th. That's one way you can read the Mishnah. The only thing that Tanakama does not allow is you can't oil and smear the figs on the 8th because they grew on the 7th. But on the 7th year, the Tanakama is very lenient. So if you go back to the Mishnah, right, go to Daf Yud Amud Aleph. So it's like a comma. Page erev shvius nichnas el shvius is going to be allowed. Is going to be allowed. What will not be allowed from shvius to matzah shvius? Tana deved Rabbi. Ve'elu hein. In other words, you connect the first clause of the Tanakama of what you are allowed, because the Mishnah began before. The Mishnah says that befedish. The Mishnah says you could. When we learned the Mishnah, what we said was, which is not what we're learning right now, the Tanakama only allows you to smear and to pierce on the 6th if it's going to become ripened on the 6th. That's what you could. The moment, period. Now, if you're going to smear it and pierce it on the 6th, but it's only going to be ripe on the 7th, or produce of the 7th, even though you want to do it on the 8th, you can't. But that's not the way they learned it. The way the Tana Rabbi Yani was, first the Tanakama says that anything that you're doing on the 6th, that's going to be ready on the 6th, is allowed to be done. The Elohein pagi erev shvius, shenichnasu l'shvius. I'm sorry. The Tanakama is learning, not only can you do the way they learned, not only can you oil and smear the 6th, it's going to become ripe on the 6th, but they learned Pshat. The Tanakama is saying that even the figs that will only become ripe on the 7th, the Tanakama is the lenient one. Tanakama is saying that you can do it because you're not harvesting it on, you're right, because it's produce of the 6th. Anything that's produce of the 6th, you can oil and smear it, even though it's only going to become ready on the 7th. It means if that was the reading in the Tanakama, the Chumrah of the Tanakama was only the 7th to the 8th, but the 6th to the 7th is always mutter. If that's what he's saying, so what is Rabbi Yehuda saying? So Rabbi Yehuda is coming to be Machman. Okay. First of all, you see that's the way they learned. So now the Gemara says not everyone agrees that way. Rabbi Lazar kemas nisan. Rabbi Lazar had the girsa the way we had it in our Mishnah. The way we had it in our Mishnah is that the Tanakama is saying that you can only oil and smear if you're going to harvest it. If it's going to become ripe on the 6th. The Tanakama is saying that the moment it's only going to become ripe on the 7th, the Tanakama is saying you cannot do it, which is how we learned. And based on that, again, Rabbi Yehuda was more lenient. However, Rabbi Yochanan kada the Tana devei Rabbi, but Rabbi Yochanan's girsa in the Mishnah was not the way we have it in our Mishnah, but the way the Gemara just quoted that fakert that the Tanakama is more machmer.
Or in actuality, it's going to be 6th and 7th, both.
So, let's go like this. One thing is clear: 6 to the 6th, everyone agrees is allowed. Question is, if you're half figs and doing the avoida on the 6th won't make it ready on the 6th. It's only going to be ready on the 7th. What does the Tanakama hold? And accordingly, what does Rabbi Yehuda hold? The way we learned it in our Mishnah, it sounds like, not the way the words in the Mishnah is, Tanakama holds you cannot. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying you could. Because you're doing it on the 6th. It's produce of the 6th. According to the understanding that the Tanakama will hold that you could, so Rabbi Yehuda is going to be more machmer, depending how you read it. So that's what the Gemara says. Al data the Rabbi Lazar, that the Tanakama is more machmer. The Tanakama only allows the 6th for the 6th. But if the 6th goes into the 7th is asur, if that is what the Tanakama is saying, so now you understand Pshat and Rabbi Yehuda. So Leba Rabbi Yehuda elolo hakel. He's arguing. So you have to know what he's arguing, you have to know what the first opinion says. But al data the Rabbi Yochanan, which is the Tana devei Rabbi, that holds that the Tanakama even allows oiling and piercing figs of the 6th, even though you know it won't be ready on the 6th. The Tanakama is saying you can do that because you're doing it on the 6th. So now Rabbi Yehuda is coming to be machmer. So the only way you can understand Pshat and Rabbi Yehuda is if you understand Pshat and the Tanakama. The way the Mishnah words it, the way our Mishnah words it, the Tanakama is saying that if it's going to be ready on the 7th, you cannot do it. The way they had the other girsa, Shitas Tanakama was you can always do it. You can always do it. And Rabbi Yehuda now is being machmer.
Seems to tie it into the end where they talk about the minhagim of the place. So if the minhag is to pierce, then you can't. If the minhag is not to pierce, then you can't. That's the explanation.
So one second. So Vlad is saying over here, hold on, that the end, yeah. Okay, another thing, not to forget, Chevron. Our Mishnah has the understanding that Rabbi Yehuda is being lenient. Our Mishnah. Tanakama is machmer, Rabbi Yehuda is being lenient. But just to make it for the record, that even Rabbi Yehuda, who's lenient, is not lenient if that's the minig of the place, that when you get the figs ready for next year, you oil it and pierce it now. Because then you're doing something for the 7th year. That's part of Tosefah Shvis. Right. It's even our Mishnah's version of the Tanakama, which makes Rabbi Yehuda lenient. He's not the carte blanche to be lenient. Very good. You can only do it if it's not the normal way of doing it. But if the way the figs become ready for the next year is by doing a certain avodah this year, then you're not allowed to do it during the time Beis Hamikdash Kayim